Hello, I'm Judy Trotter. I head up Adult Education and Learning at JW3. We've had some wonderful events over the last few years, and we wanted to share those with you while the building is closed. We do hope you enjoy them, and if you would like to, please do leave a donation on the webpage. In the meantime, please enjoy, stay safe, be well, and look after yourselves. And we look forward to seeing you when the building is open again. Bye for now.
I mean, Maureen touched on it in terms of the growth of satire, but we haven't specifically talked about that. That, of course, is early 60s. That was the week that was. Just before we plunge back into the topic, this is my opportunity to plug my courses next term. And Maureen, are you doing something next term?
Yeah.
Do you want to mention one of it?
Okay,
Say no.
well, yeah, everybody's very welcome on a Thursday morning at 10:30, just in the room down there. Modern Jewish literature, different book every week, completely eclectic, by modern anything after 1850 to the present day, completely eclectic. All welcome. You don't have to have read anything before. It's always in English translation if it wasn't even written in English. And we have a wonderful time. There we are.
So that's Thursday mornings next term.
You get to read the book first.
You can if you want, but I don't normally tell you what you're doing. But I will if you have. I will if I'm honest.
And each day is standalone.
Each week is standalone. Absolutely.
And that's starting in October.
That's starting after the Chagin
Yeah.
in October.
So the term starts in October. That's Thursday morning. Saving, are you doing it?
I'm not.
You're not?
No,
Gosh,
this is another thing,
how did we let you get away? I'm doing two things next term. A short course, just 3 weeks, called Thank You God. Can anyone make sense of the idea? Which is based on the brilliant Tim Minchin song Thank You God, which is just magnificent. And we'll pick up on the Tim Minchin song first, and then over 3 weeks we'll look at the ideas around God, whether the idea is sustainable at all, whether it can stand up to the face of the militant atheists of the current, those of Richard Dawkins and so forth. Where is that yesterday's story? Should we give up on that whole business now, before it's too late? So that's a 3-week programme starting in mid-October, and then a 1-day session on the 28th of November. These are all Tuesdays. 10:30, the 3-week programme. The 1-day session on the 28th of November, Tuesday, is called What is a Good Jew? And it's a day-long exploration as to what, if anything, would be the minimum requirements for somebody to be able to assert that they are a good Jew without easily being knocked off their perch. What does that all mean? So those are my sessions next term. Don't forget Maureen's Modern Jewish Literature. She is brilliant on this stuff, so try and get along together. All right, so before the break, we started towards the possibility, I think we can accept that all societies are going to be divided one way or another, so that's not in itself a remarkable statement. And we all know, I think it was pretty clear, and you mentioned the 50s and the angry young men and so forth, but we know that whole kitchen sink thing made it very clear that class was indubitably a great divide, even if it wasn't the great divide. And perhaps we've touched on the fact that there's another great divide, as between men and women, with men doing all the talking, and women just, quietly thinking to themselves, well, you don't get it, do you, mate? And that perhaps changed in the 60s too. The divide that we've mentioned now, for example, the sort of Brexit divide or the Trump divide, that one half of the nation doesn't understand the other half of the nation. Is this the same, or is it something different? Is there a line to be drawn between the 60s and the present day in these matters, do you think?
When you say a line, you mean a continuity?
A continuity, yeah.
I think there is absolutely a continuity. I think Trump, I suspect, I haven't done this, but let's speculate, that if you were to do a map of the 1968 American election between Hubert Humphrey and Richard Nixon, and who voted for Donald Trump as opposed to who voted for Hillary Clinton, my guess is you could more or less match up those two maps in terms of the votes. Both were relatively close elections, and the heartland of the Republicans once you'd had LBJ bringing in civil rights, once that happened, then the South went Republican forever, or at least for the foreseeable future. And I think, Brexit was absolutely that difference between London, which has voted increasingly Labour in increasingly large numbers, and voted massively to remain, and other parts of the country, whether in the east like Lincolnshire, or in the southwest like Cornwall, which voted to leave. And so I think there is a very strong difference.
Although, David, as you rightly said, in 1967, the GLC went Tory.
Yes.
So is that a different London?
Well, I think demographically there has been a huge shift. I think partly because of, again, immigration, demographic changes, social changes. So I think more and more, and I suppose one thing we haven't really commented on is the children of the 60s who are now, I guess, in their us, yes, in their 60s. I was going to say, but let's say us. It's a bit lighter. But for the last 20, 25 years have very often been the teachers, the lecturers, the social workers, the doctors, and had a massive effect, I think, quite silently on all these big social changes we've been talking about.
And the TV producers and the...
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think the difference is that maybe, so what we're saying is maybe nothing's changed, yes, but the difference is, I think, the spirit of the late 60s was that things would change, that people thought, the shadows of the 40s, it takes a long time, I think, for the shadows of World War II to move aside. And then the 50s is, again, one can't really generalise, as I think, David, you really showed us with your analysis, a certain settling and a certain consolidation and a certain pleasure in the non-disruption. And in the early 60s, that early disruption is that huge stuff is going on elsewhere in America. It's all quite nice and safe here. And then in the 60s, suddenly it thinks the future's going to be different. We are going to, I have to use the I word here. I'm going to bring idealism in. Is that all right? But so much change, and looking to young people and looking outwards rather than inwards, and thinking that technology and democracy and peace and passion and creativity, and you can all roll your eyes, but I think that idea that there was going to be change, I don't think people think that now. I think
Corbyn. Look at Corbyn. What
I'm
is
looking.
exactly what you've been describing?
No,
The youngsters who think things can change.
again,
Yeah,
we're back to
how long was that
back to-
last when they
hang on.
But it's a phase, isn't it?
I
Gosh,
think
Corbyn, and suddenly we're all
right.
there.
Okay, I would stay in the spirit of what we've been talking about, to talk about that young Corbyn thing being quite a metropolitan elite. That I'm not sure is going to have too much impact. It's a moment, it's a backlash, perhaps against what I would describe as quite a cynical, stagnant feeling. Where did that slip away to? Yes, you're right about the influence of the 60s people who had, I would say, at a second level. They're not the agenda setters. I would say the agenda setters are still, on the whole, though there are exceptions, male, Etonians, white, Oxbridge, that is still, it's being eroded a little bit, but I would say it's still in place. I'm very fascinated by the role of the royal family in all this, the trajectory from the 60s to now. You can say it's certainly changed, but they're still there. And many of these institutions are being perhaps challenged a little bit, but they're still there. But the difference is now, the Corbyn thing, I think, is a blip. On the whole, people feel very helpless about change. They do not feel empowered to change. And the people of our age are often maybe a bit defeated now and a bit worn out and tired. And young people feel economically very disempowered, and they are not sure how much they can do.
I disagree with
Oh,
you.
good. No, please, I would really
No,
love to be proven
The
wrong. on
Corbyn
this
thing
one.
is quite worrying, and I think the people who voted for Brexit, let's say the working class, will be tempted very, very strongly towards Corbyn. They have nothing to lose.
Which you think is a bad thing?
well, that's personally, but I think he will do exceptionally well, personally.
Okay.
Can I just say,
Sure.
because I think we live in this London bubble, 40% of the working population do not pay any income tax. So you're talking tens of millions of people. Because you forget the average salary in this country is like 10 to 15,000 pounds. So there are a lot of people out there suffering, and they're looking for some alternative, in my opinion. And this is Trump's done exactly the same, and it's only going to get worse.
That's a very important point, because I think one huge group of people who've been missing from this discussion so far are actually the less well off.
Correct.
And when we're talking about the 60s, we're invariably talking about people who were quite affluent, who were reaping the who had choices, who were often university educated, which is why they were rioting in universities, having sit-ins and so on. No, I think that's a very important point.
I think, however, let's just note, when you say that there's such a large proportion of people who don't pay income tax, there's been a very interesting dynamic in terms of tax policy over the last 10 to 15 years, perhaps a bit more, which is to try and take people out of income tax. It's the most remarkable to me, because income tax, of course, is the most progressive of all taxes. All other taxes are more regressive, by which I mean that income tax is potentially a redistributive tax. It's only taxed according to how rich people are, whereas things like VAT and national insurance and so on are much more regressive, or indeed BBC licence fee or anything else, which charges people flat rates whether they can afford it or not. The idea that people should be taken out of income tax, which became a big deal, and not just the Tories, the Liberals also made a big deal out of this, seems to me to be removing people from feeling like stakeholders in the business. They no longer have to contribute to the state. Other people will do that. And of course, hidden, they're contributing huge amounts through VAT and various other modes, but they're not aware of doing so. So there's something odd going on here, which is not only about their sense of disaffection or disaffection, but actually they are being encouraged to a sense of disassociation. They're not responsible. It's not their business, in a sense. It's not their money.
Yeah.
So not only are they feeling powerless, they're being told there's not much point in exercising power anyway. Other people call the shots on it.
But I think another thing that's become increasingly people being disassociated from the government of the country is, I don't know if anybody else saw This House, the play that was on at the National, in any case, which was about the Hun Parliament in the 70s. And it reminded one of the fact that then MPs had previous lives. Some had been doctors, some had been lawyers, others had been miners, others had been doctors, others. Now you go to university, you do a politics degree, and then you go and kind of make phone calls for an MP, and then you become an MP yourself. You have never ever done, driven a bus, or you've never been a doctor. You have no experience of the world that you are making legislation for.
Well,
I think it's become more and more and more removed.
Yes, although I think, to be fair, there are 635, is it? 650? I can't remember how many MPs there are. And although there is an increasing number for whom that is true, it is by no means the majority of those 600. We just don't hear about the other guys who did, in fact, have a life and do stuff and so forth. So a significant number of the people, for example, that recently elected, have come from other lives.
But there's a trend, isn't
But there is a trend, certainly. But then that trend may be towards the narrowing of experience in general, not just of MPs, but all kinds of people who are tracked very early on into particular careers, which is exceptionally odd, given the fact that we all know that nobody's going to stay in the same career all their lives. You would have thought we'd be broadening our education base in order to prepare people for generalised capacity, so that they might be at this for a little while and then become a that. But instead what we're doing is we're training them up earlier and earlier to target a career, more and more preoccupied with career choice, career decisions, making the right choice. And our kids are worrying themselves sick at age 7 as to whether they're going to get the right GCSEs to become a something or other. when in actual fact, of course, the broader campus is what's needed now more than ever before. So I think the MPs in that sense reflect what is broadly happening. But it's by no means the majority. The House of Commons is still full of a lot of people, of a lot of diverse experience. Of course, the House of Lords even more so.
May I throw in another of my annoying statistics, which is that in November 1969, a magazine called New Society, I don't know whether you remember it, did a survey. They asked 1,000 adults in Britain which changes of the 1960s they were most pleased with. And it wasn't to do with contraception, it wasn't to do with divorce legislation, it wasn't to do with legalisation of cannabis or potential revote. 51% said better old age pensions. And we forget that in the 1960s it was a time of relative affluence, reforms for the better, relatively low inflation, relatively low unemployment. And then what happens is that with the oil price catastrophe of 1974 and the beginnings of all those forces that led to deindustrialisation, the closing of the coal mines, the closing of the shipyards, the closing of the steel works, etc., etc. When we talk about powerlessness, I think that's absolutely right to talk about powerlessness today. I think that feeling comes from the massive economic global changes that have taken place in the last 40 years, but particularly perhaps in the last 15 to 20 years.
I think that's very interesting because maybe some of those people talking about old age pensions were old and they could still remember the introduction of the welfare state and what it was like when there was no safety net before. Because again, we tend to look at this whole period through the eyes of young people. But apparently there were some older people, apparently, in the 1960s, who may well have been a bit bemused by some of the changes around them. Those were the ones walking in when the Rolling Stones went on the TV and said, "What's this rubbish?" and there, lock up your daughters. But there were some other benefits that they would have seen very strongly. And it's interesting because some of the things, I think, that just seemed like absolutely good things, it's only now that we can say, yeah, but some of them got a little bit out of control. And I was thinking about something we haven't spoken about, which was travel. That suddenly people were going out more, and people were going on holidays, and the rise of the package holiday, and people discovering Europe, and people in August coming back with a suntan, and with souvenirs, and with maybe have learned a smattering of new languages. Yeah, a little bit. And also finding out that there were other types of foods, for example, and other types of clothes, and very proudly wearing their thing, either sombrero or bringing back olive oil and so on, and the effect that had, which was seen as very much as a good thing, and the sort of democratising of travel, which before had been really, and I know that our mythical people in the village outside Sunderland may not have been able to afford 2 weeks on the Greek islands, but a lot of other people who wouldn't have had that in the 50s are suddenly able to enjoy that. And that's really interesting. I think we tend to underestimate the slow drip feed of that back into our culture. And again, there was a really interesting thing in the news today about how, if you've been following this, that various places are now saying we've got too many tourists, and Spain are saying we do not. Yes, and we're fed up with this tourist town. We saw the impact of that in England as well. Places like Cornwall and Wales at various points have said either get rid of this second home culture, or our town is being taken over and swamped during the summer. And there's tremendous anger. Again, that's a form of divide, I think. Isn't it? It's a slightly different cultural divide, but it's a real one. But also the effects that air traffic has had on pollution and sort of economic things that we didn't even think about in the 60s. And it's very interesting. Rav Soloveitchik, very much the father of modern orthodoxy in America, wrote this very iconic piece, which is much quoted, called Halachic Man. And he talks about what it is to live a halachic Jewish life, a Jewish life lived according to the law. And he says something which, for him, was extraordinary, because he was saying we have to embrace modernity, and he was saying in order to be, you can still be a very Orthodox Jew and embrace modernity. And his example is that he lives in New York but works in Boston. And how did he do it? He went on the plane several times a week. He didn't go daily, but he went all the time. And he said, this is fantastic. He called this majestic. Modern life is fantastic. We must embrace it. He said this made him infinitely more advanced than his great-grandfather, who, in order to get from one village to another, it was a hazardous business with, you know, the wheel could fall off the wagon and the horse could die, and it could rain, in which case that's the end of getting from Plonts to Schmontz, you know? He can get from New York to Boston in this dignified, majestic way. Of course, nowadays, we will be horrified by the pollution and the waste of resources, etc., etc. We could do it all on the internet anyway. But there was a moment where the world really was opened up, and this was seen entirely as a good thing. I'm not sure, for all sorts of reasons, we now see it as entirely positive.
But it's not only that, is it? I mean, our capacity to absorb and accept the current situation as the norm, and then next become contemptuous of it,
Oh yeah.
means to say that we assimilate every development, and either we resent it or we just don't appreciate it. So we don't just fly, we fly cattle class, right? We don't think how majestic. We think, my goodness, I'm being treated like a piece of cattle here, chopped about and so on. We don't sit on the plane and go, look, I'm above the clouds. We sit on the plane and go, they haven't got the damn meal I ordered. You've got to pay for your tea. What kind of place is this? Right? So we assimilate every development and say, well, that's all right, and that's obvious, and that's natural, and we do that. And I'm quite struck by that New Society, was it New Society, did you say, survey in 69. 51% saying that. However, still, right through the Tory government of Thatcher, then Major, being a pensioner was a synonym for being in the impoverished classes, right? So there's pensioners were the poor. I mean, you could use either word. You could say the poor, or you could say pensioners. And it was only, I think, with New Labour and the triple lock and all the rest of it, which tipped that. And so now pensioners are resented because they're so well off, and it's a disgrace. And what about the young? So what we might simply be detecting, as perhaps this conversation has clarified for me, I think, is that we are always going to have, as it were, either the haves and have-nots, that might be the divide, or the no's and no-nots, or the in crowd and the out crowd, or the early adopters and the long resistors, or whatever it might be. But there are going to be those two groups, and they're going to shift in their tribal identity all the time. One thing I said, Maureen, that I said to you, I think earlier on, that I do want to bring to the table, and it's obsessing me, it doesn't seem to obsess everybody else to quite the same degree. It seems to me that it took about 100 years, and as we mentioned, perhaps we've not arrived there even yet, it took about 100 years to finally accept that actually, despite all appearances to the contrary, women are not so bad as we used to think, and they might even be equal to men. Right? So that's taken a very, very long time, and we're still maybe not there completely, that women can be fully accepted as being equal to men. We still have, as you say, about the pay gaps and so forth, and various different issues around sport and whatnot, and glass ceiling and all the rest of it. But broadly, I think, the argument has been won, but it's taken 100 years since it was first strongly articulated to getting more or less to that. Gay rights, first an issue in an overt way, perhaps around Oscar Wilde, but certainly by the time we were into post-First World War, lots of stuff around the army and soldiers in the First World War, and then in the interwar years and the gay young things and all of that. Gay rights came, of course, into focus, as we mentioned, in 1967 as well, with the very partial legalisation of homosexual activity. And yet we're still not quite there, although you're right, we just had the gay season on BBC, extensive, I have to say my own feeling, excessive coverage of the gay issues, not because there were some beautiful programmes on, but it just seemed to me to be remarkable given the range of various topics that might have been celebrated. It seemed a particular focus. But nevertheless, we're not there yet. And it remains true to come back to your village outside Sunderland. As a gay friend of mine tells me, there are about half a dozen streets in half a dozen cities that he'd be prepared to walk, holding the hand of his partner in Britain. Most other places he wouldn't dare. So we're not there yet. So if it took us 100 years to get our heads around women, and then it's taking us 100 years to get our heads around gays, of course the bird has already flown, because the next issue is ungendered society. Whether it's transgender, whether it's gender choice, whether it's gender fluidity, whether it's bisexualism, whether it's all of those refusals of gender entirely, or the inability to determine what constitutes gender. I'm very conscious, for example, recently in the World Athletics Championship here with, I can't remember her name, Augusta Semenya from South Africa, competing in the women's competitions, clearly to some degree masculine, and I don't understand the science of it all, but having been formally categorised as female, I presume that's something to do with chromosomes, but not necessarily hormones, and therefore some sense of, is this fair or is this not fair? Should she be racing in that race or in that other race, and how does this all work? It is clear to me that the issue of gender identity is right up in the sky now, and nobody's got a clue really what to do with it. Various bits of legislative change, trying to catch up with this. Malta, the first country in the world, to institute legislation forbidding the building of a new building with gendered toilets. Right? So in future you can't have men and women's toilets, which personally make eminent sense to me, having seen the great long queues that women have to undergo while men are just nipping in and out. It seems to me to make that a bit fairer. But it seems to me this is the next 100 years. Getting our heads around
how it plays if we map it out against our East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, South kind of divide. In North Carolina, which was tried to outlaw the idea of changing to the toilets, returning them to male and female toilets, and the Attorney General, no less, under Obama, comes down to North Carolina and says, we will make huge public cuts in your income from the federal government unless you go back on this. And this was something like 5 months before the election, the presidential election, and blow me down, how did North Carolina vote in the election? They voted massively for Donald Trump, because they're not having transsexual toilets or whatever the federal government tells them they should have. So these things will, I know it is considered among the so-called liberal elite that this is progress, this is the future. But I think we're kidding ourselves if we underestimate the amount of opposition and resistance.
Well, that's why I say I think it's going to take 100 years.
Yes.
Let's remember that the Rolling Stones, one of the criticisms of them, given their long hair, was you can't tell whether they're men or women. I mean, what are they? And then people like David Bowie and so on deliberately gender fluid. And then folk like Grayson Perry and what's the comedian? Eddie Izzard, pushing the boundaries of this still further. But you're absolutely right, this is the liberal elite. A long, long time before the village outside Sunderland changes its toilets. That I recognise.
In 100 years, the liberal elite will actually, get a robot built to their specifications and their desires. She'll never answer back. She'll never have a headache.
She.
Or he.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. This is, this was the dog that didn't bark in the 60s, and it is definitely. And in the last election, the last general election, Who's talking about the number of people who are going to be fired from their jobs, laid off, whole industries that are going to make way for robots?
There was a thing on the news a couple of months ago where they were talking about some car company, I don't know, that was, hooray, hooray, still going to build or put money into a factory somewhere in the northeast. And so this will bring jobs to the area. By then they're talking over some archives and film. And in that film, wide shot of the factory, where you saw one man in a white coat with a clipboard and a pen, and everywhere else, as far as the eye could see, you saw robots building the car. You're sitting there thinking, oh, one more job, you know.
And if you go into your local high street bank, or if you go into your local high street supermarket, you know, increasingly there's machines taking over. And this is the future. And the reason I'm sort of sceptical about the transsexual issue being the dominant issue, or a significant issue, is simply that it's going to be overtaken by technology. So that this isn't just about jobs, it is going to be about sexual preferences, possibly sexual perversities of various kinds, where people will, if they can't find a human being who will do what they want as they want it, they will get a machine. And that is the future. And therefore, transsexualism for human beings will become increasingly irrelevant, because we will soon be having silicon chip implants in our brains which will help us to learn languages, or will allow us to be better at maths, or whatever. And this will also affect every area of life.
Okay, I think, well, this is quite terrifying, really. I just want to say that I consider this quite a terrifying
So
thing.
do I, but it is the future.
It is also another example, a bit like travel, if you like, of something that at the end of the 60s, you know, technology, people were absolutely embracing it and very excited about the, saw it as a very positive thing. And maybe, despite the sort of fictional and film explorations into the horrors of sci-fi and AI, generally it was seen that this was all progress and a good thing. And I'm sure we all feel that these things have, well, you know, we just want to kind of grab as it runs away from us and bring it back into something that we can handle a bit more. It's interesting that you say that, because your idea then, and let's get back to the 60s, this idea that I mentioned earlier about entitlement, that you have the seeds planted of the entitlement of the individual, that suddenly everything is possible, that the rules are all movable, and whatever can happen maybe should happen because it can. So I think the difference with the trans question is that there is, Grace and Perry and Eddie Izzard apart, some medical stuff that's got to kind of develop along with that. If we're looking towards a future where a boy will go to a doctor from an early age and say, I think I'm a girl, I'd like to have the operation. And that's going to become sort of teenagers changing from one to another, and then maybe
it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. I know it's happening now, but I guarantee you, sure as eggs is eggs, this is a moment of transition.
Well, eggs are eggs at the moment, aren't
they? Are at the moment, but they won't be for much longer. Okay. And in 20 or 30 years, and it probably is not going to be much longer than that, if somebody wants a different kind of body, it is probably going to be a robotic body, or some form of technical body.
Just at the moment, we're in a rather, if I may say, transitional phase, because it was very interesting hearing a group of teachers addressed by an educator recently, and this educator was saying, I want to take you through the mind of a teenage person at the moment. And these teachers, who were mostly at the near retirement age, were looking quite nonplussed when this educator did this brilliant thing of saying, you know, 8 a.m, where's my phone? You know, like, eye open, where's my phone? Oh my goodness, my phone's not working. Has so-and-so Facebooked me? How many likes have I got on my Instagram picture of, you know, and so on. That their entire real life is lived online. So, and that there's another life that's lived offline, which is, for many people, far less real, not just teenagers, than the life that's lived online. Anyway, so she was taking through various questions, and some of the questions are absolutely the questions that you and I would have had. Is my friend going to be waiting for me at the end of the gate? Will I get picked to play football? What am I doing after school? Though, as this educator pointed out, for many, many more children now, it's which home am I going to? And am I spending the evening with one parent or another parent or whatever, you know, rather than sort of the blended family bringing its own questions. But these teachers are kind of nodding, because so far it's yeah, they can handle it. But one of the questions was, am I trans? Am I trans? Now, I never asked myself that question because that wasn't remotely, I didn't have the language to, or the norm, the normative framework of that question would never have got to me. So those other questions, will I be equal as a woman, or am I gay? I might well have thought of those because they are in the parameters of possibility. But when I was growing up, same for all of us, unless it was a problem that was absolutely dominant in your life, and it was something you would have to struggle with alone, you would not have looked in the mirror on a regular basis and asked yourself that question. Whereas apparently, young people nowadays will have that on their list of questions.
I beg to disagree, because I think one thing that is emerging from this conversation about the 60s is that precisely more and more people were looking in the mirror and thinking, what does a black person look like, and do I look like that? What does a Jewish person look like, and do I look like that? Am I embarrassed about my nose, or is it okay if I have a nose like Dustin Hoffman? Is it okay if I have hair like Barbara Streisand? If I'm a woman and I look at myself in the mirror, what assumptions do I have about being a woman?
I'm really happy to agree with you on those questions and assumptions, but am I trans in a way that I could do something about it, or there's a possibility, is a new question.
Folks, let's remember, when Dana International won the Eurovision Song Contest, she was a complete phenomenon. Where did such a creature come from? Right? Now, we can only speculate that when Dana International was 6 years old, this little boy said to his mum, why do I have to be a boy? And his mum looked at him and go, well, what do you want to be, a banana? I mean, come on, you're a boy. There's no two ways about that. And yet, 20 years on, Dana International has translated herself into a woman and wins the Eurovision Song Contest. And as if that wasn't bizarre enough, as it were, to the popular imagination, 10 years later, you've got, what's his name, or what's her name, from Austria?
Conchita
Wurst. Right, Conchita Wurst, who is a woman with a beard, right? A woman with a beard who's now... Now, I accept that the Eurovision Song Contest is a kind of crazy place, but nevertheless, it's also a showcase for stuff going on somewhere. And this question, am I trans, which of course was not a question any of us could have asked because we didn't know such words existed. Without the words, we can't have the concept. Young people now are asking themselves, not only am I trans, but following on from the 1960s beginning, which is what do I want, it's who shall I choose to be? It is the right to determine my own identity. So David, the nose you have, or the afro you have, or the whatever it is a choice to be made by each individual, not only in the large ethnic blocks, shall I be a Jew, shall I be a black, shall I be a man, shall I be a, whatever, which are themselves now choices, but the sub-tribes within that. So, your average Jew born and brought up in the United Synagogue 80 years ago would have assumed that they're presumably going to carry on being a Jew in the United Synagogue. But every young Jew nowadays thinks, first of all, which movement shall I connect to? Which shall I connect at all? Do I care? What shall I do? How shall I identify? What shall I call myself? And so on. These are commonplaces now of the existential right of each individual to construct themselves each morning as they look in the mirror. And although we have a tendency either to catastrophize or utopianize the future, it's all going to go horribly wrong because robots are going to take over, or it's all going to run wonderfully well because robots are going to take over, right? The fact of the matter is that the story of the last 150, 200 years, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, has been robots taking over. And in every occasion, the story has been, it will throw people out of work and there'll be nothing left for them to do. I remember in the 1960s discussing how do we prepare ourselves for a world of leisure, right? And we're still there. And we know what will happen. Yes, indeed, cars will be built by robots. And then somehow there will be more activity in the service industries.
And driven by robots.
And driven by robots. Well, there'll be more activity in the service industries. Well, because you don't have to figure out how to drive your car, you're going to be sitting in your car reading your book, and therefore there need to be more publishing or writing or something. Now, what this does for the unskilled, of course, has always been a continuous challenge for the last 200 years. But you know, we know that the creation of the typewriter was going to get rid of secretaries, and then the creation of the computer was going to get rid of typists, and the creation of the paperless office was going to get rid of paper, and you know, but here we still are.
I hate to say this, Clive, you're quite optimistic.
I am, disgracefully so, and I base it on the fact that in the past that's always been the best option, because things have worked out. They've not necessarily worked out ideally, but they do work out.
But they haven't worked out that well in parts of Wales, in you know, going back to the divide. You know, you go to areas of America and you go places in North.
The world, Britain, is indescribably better off than it was in the 60s. Indescribably so. So it is of course true that gaps have grown between the rich and the poor, that you know, that poor people are far further behind, you know, the worry about whether young people can buy their own properties and so on and so forth. Right? There are certainly great inequalities. I hope I'm not so starry-eyed as to fail to see that. But the fact that on a simple objective basis, a poor person in Wales now is far better off than a poor person in Wales 40 years ago. Far better off. We do not have starving children in the main on the streets of Britain.
And we did in 1977.
And we did in yes, we did. We had the quality of housing stock available to the homeless. Remember Kathy Come Home, right? That was a scandal which is diminished now. I'm not saying it's gone away, but it's diminished now.
I'm sorry, I'm with the lady here. I think if you go to parts of South Wales, parts of Scotland, parts of the north east of England, parts of the north of England, you will see poverty on an indescribable scale, which I think would have been unimaginable to many people in the 60s. Community cohesion has been undermined. Whole industries have just been wiped out and replaced by casualised labour or no labour at all. In the United States, I think it's even worse because this has led to an epidemic of opiate addiction, alcoholism, suicide, and in the former Soviet Union as well. In Britain, it seems somewhat less of that as yet, but these are early days.
But that's because we have a voracious mass media which requires that we research and report on everything all the time, right? The opiate addiction in America is no greater now than the alcohol catastrophe of the 1920s and 30s in America, in terms of its social destructiveness, disruption of households, undermining of the employment base, and so on and so forth. The Dust Bowl catastrophes of America, far in excess of anything that exists now. Now, I fully accept that one could pick a moment in the past and say, was that better than now, this minute? And I think that you know, recent austerity stuff and so on has certainly made matters worse for the people at the poor end of society. But I think that the manner in which we talk about that, and the way in which I think there is a broad social resolution to a kind of consensus that something needs to be done about that, is very different to the way it was in the 1940s or 1930s. It's our business. There is a far higher proportion, far higher number, don't you remember we've got a larger population, far higher number and proportion of people volunteering in social responsibility activities than was ever the case in Britain. We talk about the breakdown of social cohesion. But yet communities and people in communities are doing stuff for their communities in larger proportion and larger number than was ever the case previously. We hear about food banks and for the nurses going to food banks and so on. But research indicates that there are no nurses going to food banks for regular food requirements, that there have been examples of nurses going to food banks, but it's not as if they are regular clients of food banks. But why do they go to food banks? Because there are food banks. Right, so previously what did the nurse do in the same situation? They went hungry. But now people don't go hungry because they go to food banks, right? And when they're not going to food banks, they're either buying ready meals too, or they're eating a range of food which previously wasn't available to them, or indeed they're even going out for meals, or they're going on foreign holidays, or all kinds of things that would have been unimaginable to their parents or grandparents, but are now normal, and therefore when you can't have a holiday, then you're being deprived. And you know, there's relative and absolute poverty. Folks, I think we've reached a very clear and precise conclusion. I don't think there's any doubt about it, and I think we all know what the answer is. So I don't intend to repeat it. But I really want to thank David and Maureen for participating in this conversation and this discussion about whether or not anything from the 60s is in fact impacting on us now. Clearly there are technological things that started then that continue now and unfold now, and there were cultural and social things that started then and unfold now, but whether or not the line is ever straight or whether it's a series of advances and retreats, it's difficult to say. But absolutely properly, I'm going to leave the last word to Doris.
My child life, I'm grateful to God older, and I also feel quite content. Thank you for reiterating that to me, because I don't feel that I want to accept all the confusions it's possible to accept.
Beautiful.
And you have every right in the world. Thank you so much. Thank you really to David and to Maureen.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Clive for holding the 2 days so beautifully, for speaking and sharing.